They locked me out of my own damn house. I stood there in front of my cabin holding my key, but I couldn't get inside, not because I forgot it or because the lock was broken, but because the HOA had changed the locks without even telling me. The reason? I dared to cut down 3 dead trees on my own property, trees that I planted with my own money, on land I pay a mortgage for every month. But that wasn't even the worst part. The real kicker was they had no idea who they were messing with, because I had someone powerful in my corner, a sitting state senator who also happens to be my father. Let me back up and explain how this whole nightmare started. My name is Tyler Brooks, I'm 35, and I work as a freelance software engineer. Last year, I bought a small cabin in Maple Creek Estates as a weekend getaway, a peaceful escape from city life where I could go fishing, relax on the porch, and not worry about neighbors complaining about everything. The cabin sits on about half an acre, surrounded by pine trees, and at first, I thought I'd found the perfect retreat. Little did I know that peace came with a homeowners association that made medieval dictators look reasonable. It was a Friday evening in late September when I drove out to the cabin for what I expected would be a relaxing weekend. There were 3 oak trees near my driveway that had been dead for months, their branches hanging low and starting to look like a hazard. I'd been meaning to take them down before they fell on their own and damaged something expensive. So Saturday morning, I got out the chainsaw and spent about 2 hours removing them. They weren't big trees, maybe 12 feet tall, and honestly, the place looked better without them. I cleaned up the debris, stacked the wood for winter fires, and felt good about getting something productive done. Sunday evening, I packed up and headed back to my apartment in the city, planning to return the next weekend. That's when things took a turn. The following Friday, I pulled into my driveway around 6 p.m., grabbed my overnight bag and some groceries, and walked up to the front door. I slid my key into the lock, turned it, and nothing. It wouldn't budge. At first, I thought maybe the lock was just sticking from the recent rain, so I tried again. Still nothing. Then I noticed the lock looked different, shinier, newer. My neighbor Rachel Moore, a lawyer in her early 30s who'd always been friendly since I moved in, saw me standing there confused. She walked over and gave me that "I have bad news" look lawyers seem to practice in law school. "Tyler," she said, glancing around like someone might be listening, "the HOA changed your locks this morning." A locksmith came around 8 a.m., said something about an emergency environmental hazard response. I stared at her thinking she was joking. Emergency environmental hazard? I cut down 3 dead trees, not dumped toxic waste into the groundwater. Rachel handed me a business card with a phone number written on the back. That's Brenda Hartwell's direct line. She's the HOA president. You'll want to call her. The way she said Brenda's name told me everything I needed to know. This woman was going to be a problem. I thanked her and went back to my truck, pulling out my phone to call this mysterious Brenda person. The phone rang twice before a crisp, cold voice answered. Brenda Hartwell speaking. "Miss Hartwell, this is Tyler Brooks from 247 Maple Creek Lane. I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding about my property access." There was a pause, then she spoke like she'd rehearsed this conversation. "Mr. Brooks, you created an environmental hazard by removing trees without proper authorization, violating Regulation 15.3A of our community covenants. Under our emergency protocol, we have the authority to secure your property to prevent further damage to community resources." I clenched my jaw but kept my voice steady. "Environmental hazard? Those were 3 dead trees that were about to fall over anyway." "Dead or alive is irrelevant, Mr. Brooks," she shot back quickly. "Any tree removal requires board approval in advance. The emergency fine is $2,500 plus restoration costs. You'll receive your new key once payment is received and you've signed a compliance agreement." $2,500 for 3 dead trees? I sat in my truck looking at my own cabin, completely inaccessible to me, while Brenda talked about emergency fines like she was discussing the weather. "And if I refuse to pay?" I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. "Then your property remains secured until you comply with community standards, Mr. Brooks." The board takes environmental protection very seriously. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, like she was enjoying this power trip. After I hung up, I sat there for a few minutes, staring at my cabin windows glowing warm and inviting in the evening light, completely off limits to me. I remembered why I bought this place, to have somewhere peaceful where nobody could control what I did or how I lived. The irony wasn't lost on me. That night, I drove back to my apartment and spent hours reading everything I could find online about HOA emergency powers and property rights. By 3 a.m., I had a legal pad covered in notes and a growing suspicion that Brenda Hartwell had just made her first big mistake. 3 dead trees, an emergency environmental hazard? It sounded like someone had been watching too many legal dramas and decided to play director in real life. But if Brenda wanted to play games with paperwork and regulations, she was about to discover that this particular homeowner knew how to read the fine print. I spent that entire Sunday night reading through every page of the Maple Creek Estates HOA covenants and bylaws, fueled by coffee and the kind of focused anger that comes from being locked out of your own property. What I found was interesting. Regulation 15.3a that Brenda cited specifically referred to major landscaping changes that significantly alter the natural environment or affect community aesthetics. 3 12-foot dead trees hardly seemed to qualify as a major environmental alteration, but I needed more than my own interpretation to make a case. Monday morning, instead of heading straight to work, I took a drive through Maple Creek Estates with my phone camera. If Brenda wanted to talk about enforcement, I figured I should see how consistently these rules were applied to everyone else. What I discovered was enlightening, to put it mildly. Mrs. Patterson at the corner house had planted what looked like 20 new rose bushes sometime in the past month, completely changing her front yard landscape. The Johnson family had built a garden shed that definitely wasn't there when I moved in. The house on Elm Street had painted their fence a rich brown color instead of the beige specified in the covenants. I spent 2 hours driving around documenting what appeared to be at least 23 clear violations of various HOA regulations, none of which seemed to have resulted in emergency lockouts or $2,500 fines. Either these neighbors had all received proper approvals, or enforcement of HOA rules was more selective than Brenda had led me to believe. I had a feeling it was the latter, but I needed proof. That's when Rachel Moore proved to be more helpful than I'd expected. When I called her that evening to ask about the approval process, she mentioned that she still had access to the resident portal from when she'd helped a previous tenant resolve a minor dispute. The portal contained meeting minutes, approval records, and enforcement actions going back several years. Rachel offered to help me dig through the records, and what we found was exactly what I'd suspected, a pattern of selective enforcement that would make any reasonable person's blood boil. Tuesday afternoon, I requested a meeting with Brenda at the HOA office. The office was located in a small building near the community center, decorated with the kind of generic motivational posters you'd find in a government waiting room. Brenda sat behind a large oak desk like she was holding court, wearing a navy blazer and the expression of someone accustomed to having her authority go unquestioned. I walked in carrying a folder full of documents and my laptop, prepared for what I suspected would be an interesting conversation. Mrs. Hartwell, I began, setting my folder on her desk. I've had a chance to review the emergency protocol you mentioned. According to the bylaws, an environmental hazard must pose immediate danger to public safety or community resources. 3 dead trees, 12 feet tall, hardly seems to meet that threshold. Brenda leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. The determination of what constitutes a hazard falls under the discretionary authority of the board president, Mr. Brooks. That would be me. Her tone suggested this was the end of the discussion, but I was just getting started. I opened my laptop and pulled up the photos I'd taken around the neighborhood. That's interesting, Mrs. Hartwell. So how exactly did you determine that my 3 dead trees were an emergency hazard, but these 23 other landscaping changes weren't? I turned the screen toward her, showing photos of Mrs. Patterson's extensive rose garden installation. Brenda glanced at the screen, and I saw the first crack in her confident demeanor. Those cases were evaluated individually, she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Evaluated how? I pressed, clicking to the next photo. Mrs. Patterson planted 20 rose bushes at once. That's a significant landscape alteration. Did she submit an application for approval? Brenda's jaw tightened. Mrs. Patterson consulted with me beforehand, unlike some people who think community rules don't apply to them. The way she said it told me everything I needed to know. There was no formal approval process for those changes. This was personal preference disguised as policy enforcement. Gary Thompson, one of the board members, happened to be in the office reviewing some paperwork, and I could see him glancing over at our conversation with increasing interest. When Brenda's voice started rising and her professional mask began slipping, Gary looked genuinely surprised. I had struck a nerve, and Brenda's reaction was showing everyone in the room that this wasn't really about environmental hazards or community standards. It was about control, pure and simple. As I packed up my laptop and prepared to leave, I looked Brenda directly in the eye and said something that clearly bothered her more than all my questions about selective enforcement. You know what, Mrs. Hartwell? I think this is about a lot more than 3 dead trees. I walked out of that office, leaving Brenda looking unsettled for the first time since this whole mess started. And judging by the expression on Gary Thompson's face, I wasn't the only one beginning to see through Brenda's power play. Brenda didn't stop after the board meeting. If anything, her harassment campaign escalated. She started checking my mailbox daily, measuring my grass height with an actual ruler, and submitting complaints about my suspicious behavior at community meetings. It was clear she was trying to make me feel like I was under constant surveillance. To top it off, she even formed what she called a neighborhood watch committee specifically to monitor my activities, though it mostly consisted of Betty Morrison and 2 other residents who seemed more interested in gossip than actual safety. The absurdity of it all would have been funny if it weren't so obviously designed to wear me down and drive me away. 2 weeks into this psychological standoff, I reached what felt like my breaking point. The constant harassment, the inability to access or use my own property, and the growing sense that this fight was consuming too much of my time and energy had me seriously considering surrender. I actually drafted a text message to my father saying I should just sell the cabin and move on. That this wasn't worth the stress and legal complications anymore. But before I could send it, something happened that changed everything. Rachel Moore knocked on my apartment door that evening with an envelope in her hand and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Tyler, I think you need to see this," she said, handing me what turned out to be a letter from the previous owner of my cabin. The letter was brief but devastating. "Dear Mr. Brooks, I heard about your situation with Mrs. Hartwell through neighborhood conversations. I was too exhausted to fight her when she drove me out 3 years ago, but I kept documentation of everything she did. Enclosed are copies of her harassment patterns and evidence of similar campaigns against other residents. Use them well." Former resident of 247 Maple Creek Lane. The enclosed documents revealed a systematic pattern that made my blood run cold. For different homeowners over the past 3 years had been subjected to escalating harassment campaigns that followed an almost identical script. Initial violation notices for minor infractions. Emergency enforcement actions. Constant monitoring and citations for increasingly petty violations. And ultimately, the sale of their properties after months of psychological pressure. All 4 victims had been single males, professionals living alone, exactly my demographic. And in each case, Brenda's real estate company had eventually listed the property after the harassment campaign succeeded. Armed with this evidence, I requested time to address the community at the next monthly meeting. Word had gotten around that something significant was going to happen, and nearly 30 residents showed up to see what I had to say. Brenda sat at the head table looking confident, probably expecting me to finally surrender or make some kind of desperate emotional appeal. Instead, I stood up with a folder full of documentation and spoke in the calm, measured tone I'd learned from watching my father handle hostile press conferences. "Mrs. Hartwell," I began, "I've discovered an interesting pattern in your enforcement activities over the past 3 years. For homeowners in situations very similar to mine have been subjected to harassment campaigns that ultimately forced them to sell their properties. All 4 were single males, professionals living alone. All 4 had their properties subsequently listed by Hartwell Realty." The room went completely silent. I could see Brenda's face flush red and her hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's a completely inappropriate accusation," she snapped, but her voice cracked slightly. "Those were legitimate enforcement actions." I opened my folder and began reading specific examples of harassment tactics, documented dates and times of excessive monitoring, and evidence of selective enforcement that couldn't be explained by any legitimate community standards. Several residents in the audience began nodding and whispering to each other. Apparently, my situation wasn't as unique as I'd thought. Gary Thompson looked genuinely shocked, and even Betty Morrison seemed uncomfortable with the pattern I was revealing. But Brenda's reaction was the most telling of all. "You have no right to come into my community and attack my integrity," she shouted, standing up so abruptly that her chair fell backward. "I've protected property values here for 8 years, and I won't let some arrogant programmer destroy what I've built." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Nobody had ever seen Brenda lose composure like this. Gary tried to calm her down, but she was beyond reason. "I know exactly what you're trying to do," she continued, "and it won't work. I have the authority to protect this community from troublemakers." I stood there calmly while Brenda melted down in front of 30 witnesses, my phone recording every word of her tirade. When she finally ran out of steam and stormed out of the meeting, the community center was buzzing with conversations I'd never heard before, residents sharing their own stories of Brenda's overreach, questioning enforcement decisions they'd previously accepted, and expressing support for a more transparent approach to community governance. As I packed up my documentation, Rachel walked over with a smile I hadn't seen since this whole mess started. "What's your next move?" she asked. I looked at my phone, which had captured Brenda's complete breakdown. "Time to show everyone who Brenda Hartwell really is."